Hello, my name is Kate Buford, and I would like to welcome all of you to the James Atlas Plenary of Bio 2022, the opening session of the annual conference devoted to the craft and the art of biography. As most of you know, the plenary is designed to feature two distinguished biographers in a relaxed, unstructured conversation about their work and about biography. This year's conference and plenary theme is Disrupting the Conventions of Biography. It is our great privilege this year to welcome George Packer, former staff writer at The New Yorker for 15 years and currently writing for The Atlantic. He writes about American politics, culture, and US foreign policy. He is the author of 10 books, including The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, a winner of the 2013 National Book Award, and most recently, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal. Of particular interest for this plenary is his brilliant biography, Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century, the winner of the 2019 Hitchens Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and a finalist for the Pulitzer. Joining George in conversation is Craig Brown, the dauntingly multi-talented British journalist and author. He has written for The Guardian, The Times of London, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, among others. Most recently, he won the Baillie Gifford Prize, the UK's top award for nonfiction, for 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time, published in 2020, a take on the Fab Four that judges said had reinvented the art of biography. The US title, by the way, is 150 Glimpses of the Beatles. Nothing is Real, The Slippery Art of Biography, Craig's 2021 essay in the Times Literary Supplement, has given many biographers hours of uneasy introspection. Finally, we should like to remember James Atlas, for whom the plenary event is named. Jim died in 2019 and was a lively, brilliant, and productive biographer and loyal member of Bio. Those who knew him and the Bio organization continue to miss him. And now for the plenary.
Hi, Craig. How are you doing?
Hi, George.
So I just read your essay from, I guess, last year about the perils of biography, and it filled me with anxiety. So I wonder if you could read a bit of it so we can then talk about it and talk about what it has to do with your work and our work, and especially 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, well, it was rather full of overstatement, so I'd retract some of it. But it starts off by saying how the longest biographies, like the LBJ biography by Caro, however long they are, they're only a tiny fraction of the person's life. And so basically I'm arguing that there's something essentially artificial about biography. And I think that if you acknowledge the artificiality, then you can have a lot more fun than if you don't acknowledge it. So this is just a tiny little extract from my essay, but I thought it would give us something to kind of chew on. However indiscriminate or exhaustive any biographer may be, there is still far more that must be left out than put in. No life can be recaptured in its entirety. It follows that not even one single minute of any life could ever be recaptured as a whole, as there is not a minute in the life of the brain that can be isolated from the rest of its life. We live in the present, but we think in the past and in the present and in the future, and often all at the same time. Biography as a form is necessarily artificial. In the end, all biography is a form of fiction. As Peter Ackroyd once said, fiction requires truth-telling, whereas in a biography, one can make things up. Biography is at the mercy of information, and information is seldom there when you want it. Or occasionally there is a wealth of information, but most of it is window dressing. The shop itself is shut, visible only through the front window, its private offices firmly under lock and key. This is what makes biography the most sheepish and constrained of the arts, and the least like life. The deepest part of any life lies within the head, Thomas Wright, the author of Oscar's books, A Journey Around the Library of Oscar Wilde, wrote, I felt that his biographers had placed undue emphasis on the dramatic external episodes of his life and not enough on the inner world of his intellect and imagination. It seemed to me that the great events of Wilde's biography, to adapt his own phrase, had taken place in his brain. This is, of course, the trouble with all literary biography and most other biography besides. The real life of anyone takes place largely in the mind, yet it is only the secondary, external stuff, people met, places visited, opinions expressed, and so forth, that is accessible to the biographer. Unless they are spoken or written down, an individual's thoughts evaporate into nothing. The subject's head is, you might say, a closed book. So I thought that would give us something to sort of...
There's a lot to talk about, but I'm wondering if your acute consciousness of the artificiality of biography, and you go on to talk about other ways in which it's artificial, by what is selected and what is left out, and which version of an event is given and which version is cast aside. Does all of that hyper-consciousness lead you to the forms that you've chosen to use for biography, because the form itself is a kind of way of coping with all of that uncertainty? And
actually, I mean, I wrote the essay and thought about it after writing, well, two biographies, one of the, or sort of biographies, one of the Beatles and the previous one about Princess Margaret. So actually they sort of, in a way, came naturally rather than being born of some theory that I really just dreamt up afterwards. But I suppose they were sort of unconscious expressions of it. And actually, as I was reading your book, Our Man, I sort of felt that we were sort of thinking along the same lines, because I mean, I was very struck by very early on, you say, well, it's, you know, do you really want to read about his childhood? I don't want to talk to you about it. It's much better expressed than that. Can I just quote it to you? You say, and the book starts, and there's an introduction, but do you mind if we hurry through the early years? It's a kind of Holden Caulfield thing. Do you mind if we hurry through the early years? There are no mysteries here that can be unlocked by nursery school. Why Holbrook was Holbrook is not even the question to which we need an answer. I wonder if there's an answer for anyone, least of all him. You really need to know just one thing, and it has to do with Holbrook's father. I mean, so that seemed to me against the artificiality of, you know, most biographies. You have to get through about 120 pages of the childhood, and not even the childhood. You have to know about the great-great-great-grandfather. Even in the Beatles biographies, you know, you have to trace John Lennon to Ireland in the 19th century and that kind of thing. But so in a way, we seem to agree on this sort of, it's like cut the crap kind of element.
I'm not really a professional biographer, and when I took on this project, I was so daunted by the Caro example and the Leon Edel example, and so many examples of just comprehensiveness to the point of you know, swallowing the universe whole. That and I just didn't feel like doing that. I just sensed that my subject, Richard Holbrooke, wouldn't be able to live up to it. Readers would be falling away by the dozens, you know, within a few pages, because in a sense, he's not that important. I was writing a book about someone who was already fading from history a little bit as I was writing about him. And I wasn't, I didn't think his inner life was accessible. It was not accessible to him. He was a creature of action who never wanted to think too hard about himself. He avoided it, which was quite costly. I mean, it in the end was the thing that brought him down and maybe killed him. But so to try to gain access to that elusive inner life, which requires either a really wonderful record of it or making it up, just seemed the wrong way to go. So
but playing devil's advocate,
yeah.
it doesn't, because you couldn't gain access to it, doesn't mean that it wasn't important. I mean, something might have happened in his nursery school or in his childhood.
For sure.
Which completely determined his life. And yet even if he didn't know about it, perhaps that would have made it even more determinate.
Well, I'll do a little reading too, and then we can talk some more. So this is the opening of Our Man. Holbrook, yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it saying, you haven't read that book? You really need to read it. Saying, I feel, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are. Or saying, gotta go, Hillary's on the line. That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you. Cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you, applying continuous pressure like a strong underwater current, so that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you'd started, unsure how you got there, and mysteriously exhausted. And that paragraph was, for me, the key to being able to write this book, because that phrase, Holbrook, yes, I knew him, kind of came to me out of nowhere when I was pretty stuck. And it seemed like such a liberating and joyful avenue to pursue. I didn't know if I was allowed to pursue it because it sounded more like the beginning of a novel. And who is this I? In a sense, there is one invention in the book, and it's the narrator, at least the implied narrator. There's no claims of fact about the narrator that are false, but the voice of the narrator is someone who I don't really think is me. It's someone who knew him. I knew him, but I didn't know him. And I wanted a narrator who knew him like Marlowe, knowing his subject, someone who just knew him deeply and had the authority and maturity and years behind him to be able to tell the story without faltering and with intimacy, like a yarn. So that got me off and running. And after that, the book really came pretty naturally. But until then, I didn't know how to do it.
So had you had false starts? Had you started with the childhood?
I had no other first sentence. I just had months or even years of silence. I mean, I was doing research and delaying the writing, but I was partly delaying the writing because I didn't know how to write it. And when I thought of writing it with the great grandfather in the opening chapter, I couldn't bear it. So I sort of rescued myself from the task I'd undertaken by starting out with that Holbrook, yes, I knew him.
And when people were asking you during this period of research, what are you working on at the moment? And you said, Richard Holbrook, did they look rather sort of mystified why you would choose this
Yes.
guy first?
Yeah. The people who cared most about him, of course, didn't need persuading, but many people said, why would you do that? You have lots of other books you could be writing, or do you really think he was that important? And that too undermined my confidence in the project. And it was only when I got into the grain of the story, his letters and his audio diaries, and then the accumulated anecdotes from interviews and the sense of what a big and unruly character he was and how much history he contained in himself, that I thought, well, he's not that important in the big scheme. He's not Churchill. He's not Roosevelt. He's not even George W. Bush, but he maybe his being a secondary character is a good thing, because you can do more in a sense. You're not required to weigh in on all the things that a reader's expecting you to weigh in on and to nod to all the other versions, et cetera. He's sort of an unknown character who I got to bring to the page. And that too felt more like liberation than like a burden.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, to sort of tie in with that, I often think that it's odd that great works of fiction are usually to do with people who haven't succeeded, who are sort of failures in some way. You know,
No.
even with Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, or especially Dostoevsky, it's people on the margin or who have great aims and don't succeed. Whereas biographies, not yours, strikingly, but tend to be about, you know, Churchill or Roosevelt or Tolstoy.
Yeah.
But they don't deal with the stuff of fiction, which is life going off the rails, life not working out, you know, disappointment. Fiction is largely about disappointment.
Yeah. Yeah. I got quite interested in what we could learn about the way government works and the way bureaucracies work, and the rivalries, and how much of it is the accidents of personality rather than foreign policy as this game of chess, as Henry Kissinger would play it. It's much more kind of raw human drama, and great events happen partly because no one knows what they're doing and just stumble into it. And it was easier to convey that through someone who's in the court but isn't the king, and who's sort of working more in the hallways and the bowels of the bureaucracy rather than running everything, because he's the guy who's running up against his own rivalries and his own ambition against someone else's ambition, which is so much of what it's all about. But I wanted to ask you, Craig, you took on the four Englishmen who pretty much invented modern fame. And no one had ever been famous in history like the Beatles until then. So, and they've been written about endlessly. So you had the opposite problem. And how did you approach, first, why did you do it? And second, how did you do it in order to make it new rather than to give the reader all the oldies but goodies that they expected in opening a new book about the Beatles?
Yeah, well, the one that I'd done before, Princess Margaret, was much more marginal and a kind of disappointed figure. But then with the Beatles, you know, obviously the opposite. And I think in some ways my kind of disjointed kind of biographies would work best with people who people feel they know, and who there've been lots of books about, because then that just gives me the license. You don't then have to tell the basic story, though I do in the book. You get all the basic details because it's such an amazing kind of fairy tale. I mean, both of success and then later sort of disappointment. But I really used all the other books, and they think there have been about 2,000 books about the Beatles. I used them as not just my kind of research material, but also as a kind of excuse to not to have to go down those paths and to concentrate on, I mean, for instance, to concentrate on figures in the Beatles story who are so marginal they're barely mentioned in the Beatles books. Like there was a man called Jimmy Nicol, who in, I think, 1964, just as the Beatles had really broken, was doing a tour, that they were about to do a tour of Scandinavia and Australia when Ringo was taken very ill. He was always quite, he'd had a lot of trouble as a child from illness. Anyway, so he had to go to hospital. And this session musician, completely unknown, Jimmy Nichols, was asked to step in overnight. They were leaving the next day on the aeroplane. And so he was given a Beatles haircut, fitted out with a Beatles suit, and taken on this 10-day tour, ending up in Australia. And he was just treated like a Beatle, and had these amazing screaming fans on the way from the airport to the centre of Sydney and that sort of thing, and sat in on their press conferences. And I traced what then happened to him after the 10 days. Ringo got better, was flown out, he was flown back. And basically his life went into this terrible spiral because he had sort of ideas beyond his capabilities, and he started his own band, he paid them too much. Anyway, within a year, he'd gone bankrupt, and his wife had divorced him. And now people don't know whether he's alive or dead. The last time he was sighted was in Amsterdam about 15 years ago. And so I got very interested, not just, I mean, obviously the Beatles I find endlessly interesting themselves, but in these people who are kind of washed up by the success of the Beatles, which applies to kind of Noel Coward and even to some extent Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley. You know, they suddenly found that they weren't in the modern world, and they were struggling to catch up, and of course they became resentful and that kind of thing.
So I remember I once read an anecdote about Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys driving along somewhere in Southern California with the radio on, and suddenly he hears something like "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and he just drives off the road and realizes that he's totally screwed, that this is going to come in and wash away the Beach Boys, who were at the peak of American
I think I'm right in saying that they never did a surfing song after "I Want to Hold Your Hand." You know, So it's funny now because it's hard to see why "I Want to Hold." You know, it completely broke them in America, but it's hard to see from our vantage point now what was revolutionary about "I Want to Hold Your Hand." It just seems like a kind of sweet pop song, but it was nevertheless, you know, Bruce Springsteen. I have a chapter actually where, you know, John Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival or Bruce Springsteen, at the moment they first heard "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and it changed. You know, they had decided to become rock stars at that moment, so it was very pivotal.
And by avoiding the chronological highlights, etc., conventional approach, you had to then find a structure for doing it differently. How did you do that? How did you figure out where the Jimmy Nichols bit goes and that
was trickier because actually with Princess Margaret, because her life was just about static. I mean, for instance, she never moved house. I mean, she didn't own a house. Her life just remained what it was, from age 10 to whenever she died, age sort of 74 or so. Mm-hmm. And so with that, you could play around with chronology because it was, you know, there was no progression. But with the Beatles, I'd imagined I'd be doing the same, but actually the arc of their story, it has to go from being completely obscure to being the four most famous people in the world. And then it has to have the various kind of rifts and disagreements. And so I had to apply a certain amount of chronology to it. But within that, you can have diversions. For instance, I wrote a bit about John Lennon's disreputable father, and that kind of chapter could have gone just about anywhere. Or I had another chapter. There was lots of little chapters of my father. I remember in 1969, he was trying to get into a hotel while John and Yoko, just in the middle of the countryside, the Suffolk countryside. Well, and John and Yoko were trying to come out. And my father, who was of the generation which kind of disapproved of the Beatles, I just remembered him saying, "But I stood my ground," and so John and Yoko. So I have these little autobiographical interludes, and of course that could have gone anywhere else. I mean, but you follow a chronological line because you sort of have to, don't you? I mean,
I mean, there are three wars in Holbrook's career: Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan. And so that's the main structural principle, is deep immersion in his experience of those three wars, with the other periods of his life either completely passed over, like "Do you mind if we hurry through the early years?" or told in different ways, less his public life than his private life. There was a hinge to his whole life, which was his friendship with Anthony Lake, who was a diplomat of his vintage and was sort of the cream of the young State Department, along with Holbrook. And so they were these young princes coming up: Holbrook, the raw Jewish outsider; Lake, the smooth, waspy insider. And they were friends, but something happened to the friendship. And no one really knew what it was, but they fell out to the point where when years later Bosnia came along, they were friends during Vietnam, but by the time of Bosnia, when they were both in the Clinton administration, they absolutely hated each other and everyone knew it. And Bill Clinton would ask his aides, "What happened between Holbrook and Lake?" And what I found out was what happened was Mrs. Lake, and it was shrouded in mystery. And at one point, I'll just read a couple sentences. At one point, that I have to figure out, what did happen, because Holbrook is dead, and Mrs. Lake is extremely private. I talked to her, but it was pretty hard to even broach the subject, let alone explore it with her. And in the end, I wrote, what was this? I don't know. Two people fell in love. For how long? I don't know. And then at the end of this little passage, I say, so there's a mystery, and maybe there should be. We like to think that truth lies in details. The more details, the clearer the truth, like the cumulative pages of a trial transcript. But this piling up of facts only gives us the false assurance that we've gotten to the heart of the matter, when in fact, we understand almost nothing. There's a kind of injustice that goes by the name of thoroughness. Who could hold up under trial by biography? None of us. I'll try to stay clear of testimony, verdict, and sentence. So I sort of skirted my own inability to get to the heart of the mystery by just saying it's a mystery, and then saying something a little more general about maybe some mysteries really should be just respected, because this continual digging and plowing, there's something unseemly about it.
Yes, yes.
Janet Malcolm's book about Sylvia Plath has this devastating passage where she compares biographers to burglars who go into people's houses, the long dead, ransack their drawers for the jewelry, and then get praised by the public for bringing out, all the best stuff with this air of stolid, bank-like detachment, as she puts it. And I was sort of going in the opposite direction and not trying to be detached. And I don't think I could have had that passage about it's a mystery without that opening of Holbrook, yes, I knew him. There had to be some I who could tell you those things with a more, like almost a subjectivity that I didn't mind, that I kind of wanted. I didn't want to be the perfectly omniscient, godlike narrator here.
Or at least a lot of the stages you seem to be omniscient and godlike, but by claiming it for yourself, you're sort of showing it as artificial, if you see what I mean. That it's a friend of mine, I remember a long time ago, said that you could sort of see the bogusness in a way of biography by the fact that he said, well, who would you choose to write your biography? Who do you feel knows you? Do you think your best friend knows you enough to? And of course, everyone would say, well, unless you just wanted some kind of hack biography if you were a prime minister or something, that actually no one could know your, and also you don't know yourself. Do you? I mean, when you were saying about the accumulation of detail, giving the reader the idea that he knew everything. I mean, your book nevertheless has a lot of detail, doesn't it? I mean, so you're sort of half in that camp.
I was always looking for the detail that would create that cinematic illusion that you're really watching. You can see it happening. You can. It's scene by scene. It is, novelistic. And so what does it take to get that? I mean, first of all, it really does take a lot of work, because you have to just keep digging and digging. And it also takes a lot of discrimination about what to leave out, because you could easily lose that cinematic illusion if you overdo it, or if you interrupt it, if you don't handle the material right. But your essay filled me with like the sense of having broken some laws, because I wasn't determined to get 10 versions and then weigh them against each other and come up with what I thought was the closest possible thing to the truth, while telling the reader, I don't, this is the closest we can come, but we really don't know. And to have to do that again and again, as you said, would be pretty boring.
Yeah.
So I decided to be satisfied with versions that seemed probable and that were full of life. That's what I was always looking for, was something that brought life to the page. And I think there isn't a red line of no invention for me. I'm a Puritan about that, but there's also an impulse to want to bring it to life and not have judiciousness kill the book. So I might have fallen afoul of the rigorous questions you asked in that essay.
There are two questions. I want to know how you knew him, but also another not connected question. What do you think he would think of the book?
I knew him as a journalist. I had written about him for the New Yorker when he was Obama's envoy to Afghanistan. So I traveled to the region a couple times and spent a lot of time watching him in Washington. But he also loved journalists, wanted to be one when he was young, and found them a lot more fun than diplomats. So he liked to hang out with journalists. So he was seductive too. And he, I'm sure, tried to seduce me and perhaps did succeed to some extent. So I didn't know him well, and I only knew him in the very last years of his life, and I knew him as a journalist. But for him, that created an aura of friendship. It wasn't a formal relationship at all. He would call me out of nowhere and tell me that he'd just been traveling through Italy and he wanted to talk about Palladian architecture with me, or at least to make me feel as if he had learned something about Palladian architecture. And so there was that. He didn't respect rules. He didn't respect barriers in the least. Then suddenly he died. He died in a dramatic way. He had an aortic rupture in Hillary Clinton's office in the State Department, which for a biographer couldn't have been a better place, because that was the office he had always sought to occupy and never did. And that was the great disappointment of his life. And that's where his life ended. And then a month later, his widow offered me his papers, and I had to decide, do I take them or not? I had no idea what I would do with them, but I knew that if I said no thanks, immediately someone else would get them. So that black filing cabinet behind me, there were like 6 of those that came into my little home office here and pretty much crushed me almost physically. I couldn't even open my office door all the way while Holbrook was in here. And years went by while I fought the internal battle that I described earlier about how am I going to do this. But there was
was his widow not saying, hey, hang on, are you going to use these or shall I give them to someone else? Was she getting impatient?
Yeah, she got impatient. She rightly got impatient, because I was in the middle of another book when these papers came to me. So I had to finish that. And then I had to do other things. And I was sort of putting it off, and she rightly got impatient. And I almost handed them back a couple of times, but I would then start reading through his letters from Vietnam when he was 22, and he was so smart and observant and funny and full of life that I then realized, okay, there'll be a way. I can find a way, because there's too much life in here to hand this back.
And what with my second question, what would he?
He would be outraged by the confidence of my tone, perhaps, and the judgments, some of the judgments. He'd be outraged by some of the revelations, like the Mrs. Lake story. And then I think he also would have been deeply pleased to have had a book written about him.
Yeah.
And I think enough of a realist to know that it was better to have a book that was painful, but a good book than a lousy book that burnished his self-image. I think he would have realized that. He would never have said it, but I think he would have known that.
And it's got a lot more acclaim than, say, a biography of Jimmy Carter, or I mean, so he's sort of won in the end, hasn't he? If acclaim was what he was after.
I guess I have this image of him just continually restless in death, though, because he never got the place in history he wanted and always wanted more. It was never enough. And the book would have satisfied that appetite for a little while, but then that restless hunger would have set in again. So he was, I mean, in some ways, he was a kind of classic American figure, for better and worse.
And was there an intersection between your character and his?
No, I found myself more and more just feeling alienated from it. Like I wouldn't want anything like his life. He was always worried about seating arrangements at dinner parties and about whether he'd been invited to this commemoration and why he wasn't on the stage, and just exhausting. Looking at his calendars is exhausting, and his travel schedule and his hunger is exhausting. So I had this, kind of a wariness of that, of that degree of ambition. It's consuming. But did you ever hear? See, Holbrook would have had a lot to say about this because no one else was writing a book about him. But Paul McCartney gets a book written about him every 3 months, probably. So did you get any response from any of the?
No, I was, when I was writing it, in a way, I stopped at 1970 when they split up.
Yeah.
So I was treating it, which is, now over 50 years.
So you were thinking, do you mind if we hurry through the later years, right?
Well, yeah. I just didn't. No, the later Beatles is fine, but Paul McCartney's solo career or John Lennon.
That's what I mean.
Or even John Lennon's death,
I
kind of vaguely touch on it, but it meant that it was a historic thing. So I didn't have to look over my shoulder and think, oh, well, I didn't even want to interview Paul McCartney, which would have been a possibility, I think. I just wanted to treat them as this historic phenomenon, and so kind of have a distance from them, and which makes it more like a story. And one of the great things about the Beatles, compared to, say, the Rolling Stones or Grateful Dead or Bob Dylan, is that they have an end. There's a beginning and an amazing beginning, amazing middle, amazing end, and then it just stops.
There's no
trace Ringo Starr's solo career or something if you want,
right?
But for me, that story was
there's no endless tour of following the great work. It ended climactically even.
Yes, because the Rolling Stones are really just a kind of tribute band to themselves.
Yes.
You go and they're playing Brown Sugar and they look roughly like they did, in 1973. But
whereas the Beatles were the 60s, and in a way, it had to end in 1970. It couldn't have ended in 72. That would have been too long, too late, because it was one decade, right?
And also, you saw within their time as Beatles, the kind of weight of fame on their shoulders. The weight of success, and which in some ways kind of killed their manager, Brian Epstein. But they seem to kind of grow older. If you look at photographs of them in '69 and compare them photographs of them in '64, they look just so much older. Yet they were all under 30 when the Beatles broke up, and so I think there is some weird. I mean, they obviously kind of captured the zeitgeist, but they were also pushed on by the zeitgeist. And so I was trying to, and they aged because of the zeitgeist. And so I was trying to kind of capture that completely uncapturable thing of how success and the adoration of the world affects character. Yes. And even physique as well.
I always thought that their changes were dramatic, obviously, but that they were, yes, the zeitgeist was changing and they were doing it to the zeitgeist was doing it to them, but you only had to look at the Beatles at any moment along the way of the 1960s to understand what was happening in the culture.
Yes, and the culture was kind of, I mean, I was kind of, I was 10 in 1967, but I was already sort of getting their albums and things. And there was, everyone was sort of waiting to see what they were doing next in a way that just doesn't apply to any other group now, certainly now, and not even then. They did seem to be moving it forward. And everyone was trying to catch up, like the Beach Boys.
And did you find that, I mean, in a lot of biographies, I find that my interest wanes a bit the more familiar and famous they get, the more they become the person who you've heard of and who you've read about already. And sometimes it's the early years that are best because that's the new and revelatory, whereas once he's president, we know what happened when he was president. In fact, we've read too much about it. So did you find that happens with the Beatles? Or is fame so much about what it meant to be the Beatles that it didn't matter?
I think, I mean, your thesis does kind of work, because if you think of, say, Paul McCartney, I mean, I'm not that interested in the last 30 years of Paul McCartney. I mean, I admire him in lots of ways for keeping going and, being kind of personable and, disporting himself well. But I'm not interested in him. And so I suppose if I hadn't cut it off at that moment, but I think with the Beatles, I was as interested in them, because they just kept, they were changing so quickly, John suddenly going with Yoko and doing baggism and all that stuff, or even doing these kind of weird recordings like Revolution #9 on the White Album, and it was only, I mean, I think I put in the book that it's only 5 years between I Want to Hold Your Hand and Why Don't We Do It in the Road? There's a kind of progression there on virtually every level. Probably not musical in the case of that song. But.
And the mysteries that we were talking about, for me, the ultimate mystery of the Beatles is how did they write such great songs over and over? And I've read a lot of accounts of the composition and engineering and production of all of their songs, but I never feel I've gotten to the heart of it. Where did the idea come from? How did it evolve? Get Back, this great documentary.
Yeah, there's a bit in that where you actually see the song Get Back being composed.
That's the closest I've come. Did you try to get to the heart of that mystery?
No, I mean, I think anyone wanting to get to the heart of that mystery would be much better just looking at that section when Paul starts strumming and gets this idea in his head. And that will tell you far more than my book ever. I mean, the trouble with a book is it's words, it's not music, and so you can't. So they're very divorced from each other. I mean, I can, there's stuff about, John. I mean, I think a lot of it was John and Paul's. Well, they're contrasting characters, deeply contrasting characters, and this kind of competitive friendship. Which meant that even when towards the end of the Beatles, when they were composing by themselves, they were still trying to impress above all the other one, and so in a way it was a collaboration even when it wasn't. And I think there are things you can kind of hint at, and but for the actual music, you've got to listen to the music.
There's a moment in Get Back when they're together playing, and it's that you can see that happening. But we're talking about and supposed to be talking about disruptions of biographical conventions. So I'm wondering if you have any warnings for potential disruptors about what shouldn't be disrupted or what can go wrong if you try to break some of the conventions.
Well, I completely agree with something you said earlier, which was, you want it authentic. I mean, you want the truth. So though I have flights of fancy in my book, I mean, for instance, in the Beatles book, I have a chapter on imagining Jerry and the Pacemakers having been the world famous group and the Beatles not having made it.
But that's a thought experiment, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then it takes the Beatles up, to the 70s, where they're just being a Jerry and Pacemakers kind of tribute group. So, but I think, which obviously didn't happen, but as long as you acknowledge it didn't happen, I think it's all right. It's just that, I mean, with serious, in quotes, biographies, there are so many, when you compare sort of 4 serious biographies, say of Churchill or, Queen Victoria or something like that, virtually every paragraph, there is contradictions, and there is an amount that's made up by even conscientious, pedantic biographers. And as you were saying, you go for the most probable of all the memories of a particular incident. You go for what's probable, because otherwise you go mad just presenting all the different accounts.
You'll go mad, like your description of all the versions of the night Proust and Joyce met. They're all amazing variations on that, but imagine a biographer having to, or you could simply make that the point of the biography, or at least the point of that scene that we cannot know, because here are all these different versions from different witnesses.
But then you'd be having to appeal to a kind of obsessive reader who shared your own interests. I might just do, there's a tiny little bit which sort of illustrates things. I don't know if you read it. Maybe he's not even famous in America, but it's kind of great Edwardian biographer, Lytton Strachey, who was the first.
I actually read Eminent Victorians when I was trying to figure out how to write about
I see. Well,
Richard
that's
Holbrooke.
Because he does it with that great confidence, and there's kind of swagger to it, but it's very witty. But also, and there's a bit in his biography of Queen Victoria where he imagines her dying thoughts, which obviously you don't have access to. Though actually, Yung Chang, in her biography of Mao, as far as I remember, she sort of suggests his dying thoughts, but she doesn't. In some ways, she doesn't acknowledge that she's just imagining them.
Yeah, you took her to task for that. Pretty.
Yeah, I think it's all right if the reader is completely conscious this is a kind of flight of fancy, but if you try and make them succumb to the idea that it's documentary, I think that's bogus.
I think there's a contract that gets broken if you go that way without bringing the reader along and telling them you're doing it.
Yeah, and it's very, and often you hear, often in biographies, because I review a lot of books, and you see the word probably, this probably happened, and then a few paragraphs later, it definitely has happened. They've forgotten that they used the word probably, and they act on the presumption that it did. And there are lots of dodgy. I mean, I call this essay the slippery art of biography, because it is very slippery.
But I think you have to go with something that you think is probable. But once given that, I have a bias toward just vividness and what I keep calling life, because I have this dread that the reader is about to give up at every page. I am about to lose the reader, and I can't afford to. So I need to keep bringing the strongest heartbeat I can to the account, or else the audience is going to start heading for the exits.
I think basically we're both journalists, so we want to get people reading, keep them reading to the end. Whereas there's a brand of academic biography, probably more academics write biographies than journalists.
So you were going to read something.
Yeah. But I was going to say the academics are just used to students having to sit there for an hour and listen to what they say. Anyway, this is my own take. It's a kind of pastiche of Lytton Strachey. It's Princess Margaret's dying thoughts. I mean, some will be kind of inexplicable, but if you haven't read the book, but though I put it right at the beginning. Yet perhaps in the secret chambers of consciousness, she had her thoughts too. Perhaps her fading mind called out once more the shadows of the past to float before it, and retraced for the last time the vanished visions of that long history, passing back and back through the cloud of years to older and even older memories, to the warm clasp of her nanny, so full of do's and don'ts, to Sir Roy Strong's strange clothes and high demeanour, and her last afternoon tea with Peter Townsend, and Tony Snowdon dancing attendance on her mother, and Roddy emerging from the sea at Mustique in his brand new trunks, and the audience hooting with laughter at Dusty Springfield's impertinent aside, and President Johnson steering her into dinner in the White House, his right palm lingering perhaps a little too long on her royal behind, and the old Queen, her grandmother, reprimanding her for erratic behaviour with a bouncing ball, and Lilibet, that's the Queen's, voice down the telephone reassuring her once more that no harm had been done, and her mother laughing and saying such fun before giving her that pitying look, and her father on his final evening bidding her good night and see you in the morning. So it's all an invention.
There's no way I could wish that that passage did not exist. But the word perhaps is doing an awful lot of work. And I think that part of the success of that beautiful ending is perhaps is a weak word. It's a word that we don't want to have to use, but you use it scrupulously. But then it's so long forgotten by the time we get to the end of the sentence that it doesn't matter that this is all perhaps.
I hope so.
I think we pretty much run out of time. I wish we could yammer on for another couple hours because it's really been fun.
We must continue next time you come to London.
I will come see you next time. And I hope you'll do that if you come to New York.
I will.
All right. Take care, Craig.
Thanks a lot, George.